I'm David Scallon from FACE. We've come out into the Belgian countryside to highlight the problems associated with the restriction on phasing out lead shot for hunting over wetlands. And you're probably wondering why I'm positioned here beside this puddle. The reason why I'm here is because this puddle constitutes a wetland for the purpose of this restriction. And we were unsure whether this was the case or not, but the European Commission clarified this in an answer to a PQ, and you can see the link on the screen. This is going to be a major problem because this was here today because it rained this morning, but this may not be here tomorrow. And the challenge of a puddle like this falling under the definition of a wetland is that it will make it impossible to determine whether there are wetlands within 100 meters of the hunter or the enforcement officer or not, because they're purely dependent on the weather. In this area, which is a hunting area, about 80 meters away, there is some tall maize growing, and that's used for hunting pheasant and partridge during the winter. There's no other permanent water here, so there's no reason to assume that hunters would be required to use non-lead shot. The other issue with the definition of a wetland is that it includes dry peatlands. Peatlands are difficult to define in themselves, and the Commission's JRC has also stressed this, the challenges with defining peatlands. And huge areas of the north of England, Scotland, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries and Poland have a lot of areas of peatlands but without any visible water. And it's very difficult to know at the field level whether you're on wetlands or not. And the Commission's reply to this has been, well, that's a job for mapping for member states. But no member state has mapped dry peatlands at that field level. And keep in mind how challenging it is even to define peatlands. I mean, these are discussions between peatland ecologists and botanists. They're constantly discussing the definition of peatlands. And then the next issue, if member states were to go mapping peatlands, the entire area of peatlands changes in response to weather conditions. So a small puddle in an otherwise dry, arable field constitutes a wetland. And that's going to make it impossible to apply in practice. There's a few solutions here. Number one, refine this definition of a wetland, in particular with this concept of dry peatlands. There needs to be minimum sizes. Also, there needs to be guidance on what constitutes a wetland for the purpose of this restriction. One easy option is to delete this concept of buffer zones. You can do this and then you will solve a whole raft of problems about carrying lead gunshot and being in possession of lead gunshot when you don't actually know if you're near an area of water or not. ECHA's opinion was that not to include buffer zones, but make it a case where hunters cannot discharge lead gunshot into wetlands. And that's the regulation in force in many member states. And you also have to consider that no member state has used this full definition of Ramsar with peatlands and with dry peatlands. So this is a very new concept that's going to make it extremely challenging. ECHA's Enforcement Forum produced an opinion on this, which is available if it's requested. And they were highly critical about the definition of wetlands under Ramsar, but they were also very critical about whether the terms possession and use are even applicable under the REACH regulation. This is the first time in history that the REACH regulation is going to restrict ordinary citizens, consumers, but in this case hunters. Normally the addressees are industry. This is a very open question and it hasn't had the level of discussion that's needed, but it's worth looking at the opinion on ECHA's Enforcement Forum on this. And they were also highly critical of, as I said, the definition of wetlands. Another key point is that the proposal introduces a fundamental legal problem. The presumption of innocence is a fundamental right enshrined in EU law and in the national legislation of member states. Only in a few very extreme situations where it's very well justified and very proportionate, can you apply this presumption of guilt. And this is certainly not the case for the purpose of this regulation, where the Commission's answer is, well, it will make enforcement easier. So there's a fundamental legal problem here that needs to be addressed. I will be walking during the course of a day's hunting. I will have steel shot in my left pocket. I will have lead gunshot in my right pocket because I intend to do some water bird shooting or hunting. And then later in the day, I will be on some arable land or dry woodland that's not peatlands for pheasant, for hare, for woodcock. To conclude this, I want to also clarify one big misunderstanding with respect to FACE's position on phasing out lead shot over wetlands. We've had a position on this, it's been clear, for over 15 years. But our problem here is that the proposal that's on the table is unworkable. It won't be understandable in the field to hunters and to enforcement officers, and there are some fundamental legal problems that have not yet been addressed. We're calling upon decision makers to take these issues into account and to follow the advice of EU agencies, follow the advice of SEAC, the Socioeconomic Assessment Committee, and in particular look at the opinion of ECHA's Enforcement Forum. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hopefully having a regulation that's workable for Europe's hunters, that's understandable for Europe's hunters, that won't lead to a wide range of legal problems. This should not have been so difficult, but unfortunately it's turned out to be a very complex task, far more complex than it should have been.